Hello. Welcome to a special holiday episode of the If podcast. Tech Witch is on hiatus until the end of January, but in the holiday spirit, and in homage to Doctor Who, we have a special time-traveling Christmas episode for you. This episode is not Tech Witch, but hopefully you'll enjoy as well. Before we start today's episode, I want to mention a couple things. If you are enjoying the If podcast, please make sure to rate us and leave a review wherever you're listening. Reviews and ratings really do help us a ton. Also, don't forget to follow or subscribe to the If podcast. That way you won't miss any of the upcoming episodes. Well, I think that's enough rambling for now. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoy More Time, a time-traveling Christmas story. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. More Time, a time-traveling Christmas story, written, produced and edited by Damion Taylor. Performed by Damion Taylor with AI assistance. It's time, sir. The family is waiting. The town car driver gently nudged Xavier to break his trance. They had just arrived at his grandparents' house for the repass and reading of his grandfather's will. Xavier sat in the back of the town car, staring out of the window at the deceptively big ranch-style house, typical in Southern California. He had been the first of the family to arrive, but had now been sitting in the car for the past 45 minutes, watching the steady parade of family, friends, neighbors, and his grandfather's professional colleagues enter the house. The day was oddly perfect for December, the kind of dispassionate, boring day you get in the paintings of amateur artists or bad love poems. Bright, saturated blue skies with sparse, puffy clouds, and a gentle breeze that was neither too hot or too cold, just right. Where the hell is a melodramatic thunderstorm when you need one? Xavier murmured before briefly glancing at the house across the street. Ray Charles used to live there. My mom grew up with his kids, mused Xavier as he pointed unenthusiastically out of the window. Xavier remembered the stories his mom and grandfather used to tell about how vibrant Baldwin Hills was back then. He remembered the stories about how this was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and the only one where affluent black people were allowed to live. Everyone in the family could recount his grandfather's rags to riches story. I arrived in the city 2 days before Christmas Eve, with only the money in my pocket and no way to get back home. That was enough for 2 nights in a hotel. Desperate for money, I decided to visit the university physics department to see if I could get a job in a lab. I knew the students were off for the winter break and figured any really smart professor would probably still be working. Fortunately, my bet paid off. I met Dr. Anderson. I saw an open door to one of the labs and marched right in and said, "Hi, I'm Horace Horton. I love physics and need a job." Dr. Anderson hired me right on the spot. Apparently, he had a hard time finding lab assistants who wanted to work in a more theoretical physics lab, but it was exactly what I was looking for. With a letter from Dr. Anderson, I was able to rent my first apartment in the city on Christmas Eve. The job at that lab is where I met my research partner, Virginia Duan. Virginia and I would go on to publish many white papers and make several technological breakthroughs that are the reason my family can live in this big house across the street from the likes of Ray Charles. That was the beginning of my new life. Xavier smiled as he recounted his grandfather's famous story in his head. All my life, or at least as long as I can remember, I've been close to my grandfather. He was my hero. Today of all days, I can't help but to feel nostalgic. It just doesn't seem real, Xavier mused, speaking to no one in particular. Suddenly, Xavier straightened his spine, shook his head, and opened the car door. "Let's do this." He stepped out of the car erect and confident, ready to conquer the world. He was the complete antithesis of the mumbling, nostalgic young man he'd been just moments before. He walked toward the house. Upon entering the house, Xavier's eyes were immediately drawn to the expansive windows that opened up to the familiar view of the ocean in the distance. He could just make out Catalina Island through the marine layer. The view was hypnotic. Catalina seemed to be defiantly rising from the sea, and exhaling to expel the surrounding clouds with the satisfaction of accomplishment. Xavier had always loved that view. He could stare out at the ocean for hours, lost in meandering thoughts. Staring off into the void and getting lost in his own thoughts was kind of Xavier's thing, just like Grandpa. Xavier paused to take it all in. Then just like that, the serenity of the moment was shattered as Xavier's senses were violently overwhelmed by the enticing aromas of comfort foods of every ilk, and his stomach reminded him of how hungry he was. His stomach gurgled loudly, and then made a sort of whimpering sound, just in time for his auntie to hear as she passed by. "How you doing, baby cakes?" said Auntie Jean, as she hugged him and kissed his cheek. She continued without waiting for him to reply. "It sounds like you need to go on in the other room and get you some food." "Okay, Auntie," Xavier muttered, as she ushered him through the family room into the all-white formal dining room that only got used once or twice every few years. As soon as Xavier saw the food, his mouth began to water. He couldn't get it on a plate and into his mouth fast enough. The stress of his grandfather's upcoming funeral had distracted him for the past few days, so his last meal was lunch the day before. But now, all that mattered was shoveling food into his mouth. Xavier barely registered Auntie Jean's unmistakable, raucous laugh as she watched him scarf down some catfish, hush puppies, and macaroni and cheese in what seemed like seconds. "Slow down, boy. The food ain't going nowhere," she chuckled. Auntie Jean could be really sweet when she wanted to be. As a child, Auntie Jean was his favorite auntie. She was so funny and always the life of the party. As he grew older, he slowly began to discover her more narcissistic, selfish characteristics. He realized that she always had to be the center of attention, otherwise she got pretty pouty and less than friendly. Out of nowhere, someone grabbed Xavier from behind in a big bear hug, causing him to almost drop his plate and choke on the hush puppy he was eating. The hug was followed by a low, gravelly greeting. "How you holding up, Waterhead?" It was Uncle Carrie. Uncle Carrie was a big man, a really big man. At first glance, most people were easily intimidated by him. However, once you got to know him, you'd quickly realize that his size was the only intimidating thing about him. He was so kind and had the biggest heart of anyone Xavier knew. Ever since Xavier was little, he always called Xavier Waterhead. He said it was because, when Xavier was a kid, he had a really big head that looked like a jug of water. To this day, he's the only person Xavier knew who could make what should be an insult into a term of endearment. There was just something about his earnesty and lack of malice that made you love him. "I'm holding up okay. I think I'm still in shock. The reality that Grandpa is gone probably won't really sink in until next week," Xavier said, surprised by how unguarded and sincere his response was. Next week was Xavier's birthday. Not really a monumentous birthday or anything, he was only turning 26. But it would probably be the least enjoyable birthday of his life, because it was also Grandpa's birthday. It would be the first birthday in his life that Xavier and Grandpa wouldn't be celebrating together. That's the thing with Uncle Carrie. He had a way of just making everyone feel comfortable, safe. Somehow, everyone found themselves willing to be vulnerable and honest around him. The funeral was like a sideshow of odd characters. Until now, Xavier never truly realized how quirky his family could be. There was Uncle Donald, who was always trying to sell something that nobody wanted. This week, it was green mint-flavored chlorophyll water. What is that even? Then there was Uncle Carrie's wife, Auntie Versi, who thought that every event was her chance to be a star or simply an excuse to be melodramatic. Whether it was showing up to a family karaoke night at the community center in a sequined ball gown in case any record label executives showed up, or pretending to faint one Christmas when Auntie Jean said all of her songs sounded alike. She was definitely going to make things interesting. There was also Xavier's mom's cousin Weenie Man, whose real name he has never known and seems like some closely guarded family secret for some reason. It didn't help that Weenie Man's wife was named Cookie, and unlike Weenie Man, Cookie was her real name. Weenie Man was always running around taking photos at the most inopportune times, like when you're shoveling food into your mouth and almost choking at a funeral. To most people, a funeral isn't the best situation for a photo op, But according to Weenie Man, everyone was going to want to have some photos to remember the day. After about an hour of, well, interesting small talk with family and friends, it was finally time to read the will. Xavier wasn't completely sure what to expect, but knowing his family, he could rest assured it would almost certainly be a dramatic affair. And it was. Auntie Jean was yelling about how she deserved more money. Giant Uncle Carrie was sobbing uncontrollably while sitting on a chair clearly too small for him. Cousin Weenie Man's wife Cookie fainted and Auntie Versi put on a spectacle, wailing, falling to her knees while calling out to the sky that it can't be real. It was straight out of that movie Kingdom Come with Whoopi Goldberg and Jada Pinkett Smith. Braced for melodrama, Xavier thought he had prepared himself for everything, but then the executor of Grandpa's estate read his name and time stopped. And to my grandson Xavier, I am leaving my most prized possession. I am leaving him my favorite watch. A watch? That's it? I thought I was his favorite, Xavier exclaimed in his head. On the outside, Xavier just tried to look sullen and grateful. On one hand, Xavier really didn't expect anything from his grandfather. He just figured if he did get something, it would have been more precious and meaningful than a watch he'd never seen his grandfather wear. Xavier felt like he'd been slapped in the face. When the executor handed Xavier the watch, she furtively slipped him a small note and whispered under her breath, "Your grandfather's will also wanted me to give you this note with explicit instructions that you not read it until you get home. No one else in the family can know about this." Xavier looked at the executor with a puzzled expression, as the executor pretended like the whole note thing never happened and simply replied, "He loved you more than anything. Never forget him." Xavier couldn't remember the rest of the funeral or reading of the will after that. All he could think about was getting home to read the letter from Grandpa. As soon as he arrived home, he closed the door, went straight to the living room and placed the note on the coffee table and the watch right beside it. He was dying to read the note, but for some reason he just stared at it. He stared at the note for about 10 minutes before mustering the courage to open it. "Dear Xavier, if you're reading this, it means that I have died. I am sure that my death has been especially hard on you of all people. But if there is one thing I can say to make you feel better, it's that you have no need to be sad. I am and always will be with you. I don't mean that in some sappy philosophical way, but I mean that I literally am and always will be with you. I know you are a bit confused and disappointed that all I left you is my watch, but you should know that it truly is my most prized possession. There are only 2 people in the world who know of its existence, me and my research partner, Virginia Duan. You see, my watch is a time travel device. It will allow you to travel back in time. Use it wisely. As I have learned the hard way, time travel is complicated and will teach you more about yourself and life than you could imagine. It will also teach you the value of living in the present. Love, Grandpa Horace." "What the hell?" Xavier yelled as he threw the note down on the coffee table. Grandpa must have been losing it in his final days, he thought to himself. But that couldn't be. The note was dated 10 years ago. Wait, was that right? That couldn't be right. Why would Grandpa write this note 10 years ago? Nothing was making sense. Not being one who could resist solving a mystery or problem, Xavier knew that he had to get to the bottom of this, now. So, Xavier decided to track down Virginia Duan. If anyone could help him get to the bottom of this, she could. Tracking down Virginia Duan wasn't hard. It took less than 24 hours and Xavier found himself at her doorstep, questioning his sanity. He rang the doorbell and waited. No answer. So, he rang the doorbell again. After a few moments, he heard someone yelling, "I'll be right there. Give me a goddamn minute, for heaven's sake." Eventually, the door opened, and there in front of him stood a small old woman with multicolored hair, not at all what Xavier was expecting. "Hi, Xavier. Come in. We have a lot to talk about, and by the look on your face, I'm assuming you have a lot of questions." Virginia's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she had been expecting him. How do you know my name?" stammered Xavier. Virginia stopped walking and turned around. "You look exactly like he did when I met him. Now please close my door. I have nosy neighbors. Xavier followed Virginia to the living room, where she invited him to sit down before diving right in. This time with a gentle tone, full of the fondness reserved for those closest to you. I'm sorry I didn't attend your grandfather's funeral. It was just too much for me. I have been having a hard time with the fact that my dearest friend is dead. Virginia's tone was soft and sincere, as she distractedly looked down at the floor before sitting on a plush sofa and returning to her original matter-of-fact tone. Horace said you would be coming to see me after his funeral to ask about the watch. Yes, it is a time machine. There was a pregnant silence as Virginia sat quietly to let that one sink in a bit. She figured that all of this was a lot for anyone to swallow. Were it not for the fact that she helped make the damn thing, she'd probably have a hard time believing it too. Do you want to know how it works? She asked. Yeah, sure, was all that Xavier could stammer. Virginia explained how the watch worked and how if he traveled back in time it would essentially erase him from the present. The present would rewrite itself from the moment he left as if he never existed, or as if he went missing. It was really a bit of a crapshoot and hard to predict. In the meantime, she explained, his existence would be inserted into a new point in the past, where he would be the only person aware of what's happening, and thus creating a new future. It would also create a paradox loop of sorts, which sounded way worse than it actually was. In essence, all the paradox loop would mean is that, if Xavier didn't return to the exact same moment as when he left, he'd end up repeating the events of his life over and over again without the ability to break the loop. After talking to Virginia for hours, Xavier sat in front of Virginia's house in his gray Ford Fusion, his head swimming with so many unanswered questions that he wished he asked Grandpa Horace. There was clearly so much he didn't know about this man, who he idolized and thought he knew. Why did Grandpa and Virginia not tell anyone about this? Correction, why didn't Grandpa Horace tell Xavier about this? How many times had Grandpa ever traveled back in time? What happens if you travel to the future? Xavier knew that the only way to get answers to his questions was to travel back to the past and find out from his grandfather. Unfortunately, Xavier also realized that the only concrete date and time he knew of in Grandpa Horace's life is when he arrived in the city and started working for Dr. Anderson. Unable to just leave a good mystery or problem unsolved, Xavier decided that he was definitely going back in time to see Grandpa Horace one last time. Just for a little while, and then he would come right back. What harm could it do if he came right back to the same moment that he left? Xavier also knew exactly when he wanted to see his grandfather. He wanted to know more about the young man who arrived to a new city with essentially nothing and built an amazing life for himself and his family. Xavier was going back to meet Grandpa Horace on the day he arrived in Los Angeles. If Xavier was going to do this, it had to be now, otherwise he would lose his nerve. So he started up his car and headed home to grab a jacket and a collection of bicentennial $20 bills and coins printed in 1976 that he and Grandpa Horace had been collecting over the years. In total, he had $60. That should be plenty for a day in LA back in the 70s. With his preparations complete, Xavier set the watch as Virginia Duan instructed, pulled the pin and was gone. He couldn't believe it. Just like that, he was standing on Helms Avenue in Culver City, right in front of the apartment building where Grandpa Horace got his first apartment. But it wasn't Christmas Eve yet, so Xavier figured he should first go wait at the hotel, where Grandpa first stayed when he arrived in the city. The hotel was small, but nice by 1970s standards. Xavier marched up to the front desk and asked if Horace Horton had checked in yet, and was told they did not have any guests by that name staying at the hotel. Perfect, thought Xavier. I beat him here. I'll just wait and pretend to accidentally bump into him when he arrives. Xavier sat down in one of the lobby chairs and reached for a magazine to read while he waited. However, while reaching to pick up a Time magazine, he noticed a nasty crack in the watch face. Uh-oh, that can't be good, as an uneasy thought occurred to him. What if the watch breaks? How do I get back home? Well, it was too late to worry about that now, He was in 1976 and would have to cross that bridge when he got to it. But surely between Grandpa, Virginia, and Dr. Anderson, they could figure out a way to fix it. Several hours passed and still no Grandpa Horace. The sun was beginning to set, and according to Grandpa's story, he should have arrived by now. Xavier started to get really nervous. What if I just rewrote history? What if I just messed everything up by being so impulsive and selfish? Well, Xavier decided that for the time being all he could do was to wait. So he decided to get a room so he could rest a bit. Then he would check in at the front desk later to see if Grandpa Horace had arrived. Xavier went up to the hotel front desk. There was a new young man working. Xavier hadn't even noticed the shift change. "I'd like a room, please," Xavier said politely. "For one night." Based on the sign outside the hotel, Xavier only had enough money for 2 nights at the hotel, so hopefully Grandpa would arrive soon and could help him get the watch thing figured out quickly. "Yes, sir," said the young man behind the counter. "How much is that?" Xavier asked. $29.89, that includes tax," the hotel worker said. Xavier pulled out the money he brought and handed it over. "Thank you, sir. You will be in room 32, just past the elevator on the left." Xavier took the room key, walked across the lobby, and turned down the hall to check out the room. He thought that maybe while he waited, he could figure out how to fix the watch. The room was nothing special and undeniably from the 1970s. There wasn't even a microwave or Wi-Fi. Then there was the ginormous phone on the side table. Wow! How did people live like this? He thought. Xavier eventually fell asleep. When he awoke in the morning, he was panicked. Was he stuck here? He had to find his grandfather or Dr. Anderson to fix the watch for him. He walked briskly to the front desk to ask if anyone with the name Horace Horton had checked in. The woman at the check-in desk looked at him like he was crazy before rolling her eyes and answering no. Crap. What was going on? Had Xavier got the details of Grandpa Horace's story wrong? Could it be that Grandpa made the whole thing up? Whatever the answer, this was not good. Xavier had to find Professor Anderson's lab if he had any chance of getting back home to his own time. But he didn't have a car and had no idea how to catch the bus. Plus, he had spent half his money on the hotel room. So, Xavier did the only thing he could think of. He hitchhiked all the way to UCLA from Culver City, something else he had seen on a movie and according to his grandpa was relatively safe-ish during this time. After asking for directions from what seemed like the only two people on campus, Xavier finally reached the physics building and located Dr. Anderson's lab. It took everything in him not to run to the lab and bust in like a wild man, raving about a time machine watch. He focused all of his concentration on remaining calm. He was so focused on remaining calm that he walked smack into a young Virginia Duan as she was exiting the lab. Both Xavier and Virginia were startled by the collision and sat there staring at each other in confused shock for a few seconds. "No one else is supposed to be here," Virginia chided in exasperation. "I'm so sorry to startle you," blurted Xavier. "Have you seen Dr. Anderson around?" But before Virginia could answer, Dr. Anderson came striding out of his office. He was much smaller than Xavier had imagined. He looked a bit like a short, squatty Yosemite Sam, without the pistols and facial hair. He was definitely the living embodiment of a nutty professor. "Did I hear my name?" Dr. Anderson asked before realizing that there was a stranger standing in the lab who he didn't recognize. Cheerfully, Dr. Anderson asked, "Who's your friend, Virginia?" "I have no idea who this guy is. He almost gave me a heart attack when I was walking out of the lab." It was then that Xavier realized what was happening. His grandfather's letter suddenly made sense. The reason he never told Xavier about the watch. The reason he repeated his rags to riches story so fervently. Suddenly, Xavier understood why he and his grandfather were so much alike, and even shared the same birthday. His grandfather was never going to show up. The Horace Horton he thought he knew didn't exist. Xavier turned to Dr. Anderson and put out his hand and said, "Hi, I'm Horace Horton. I love physics and need a job.